In this news roundup of the week, Boris Johnson fights for his political life while a nudge unit founder says that Project Fear went too far. President Biden invokes extraordinary divisive rhetoric on voting rights, and Australia decides once again to kick world number one tennis superstar Novak Djokovic out of the country. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. In the UK, everyone is immensely cross with Boris Johnson because he attended a bring your own booze party in the number 10 Gardens. The problem was that this was in May 2020, in the middle of the most strict lockdown, when you were just about allowed out to exercise in the presence of one other person from your own household. You definitely weren't supposed to be meeting with others, even outside, even in your own garden. Now, that was always overkill. One reason why subsequent lockdowns were at least a little more rational on the basis that being outdoors, not in tight crowds, you would be fairly safe. And from my point of view, the fact that these were all workers from the same building who had to keep working because they were running the pandemic response, they were essential workers, the fact they moved out into the garden and had a couple of drinks, I'm good with that. As an exercise in common sense and judgment of acceptable risk, except for the fact that the people present at that party had determined that nobody else in the country was to be trusted to listen to guidance and then follow their common sense and their judgment. The rules were strict, they had to be followed to the letter, and even when you did so, you could still be buzzed by police drones or challenged for being in your own garden, things that were happening at that point in time. So, if you're going to infantilise the nation with such strict rules that you do not allow any flexibility, any use of situational judgment, then you have to expect to be held to the same ridiculous standards, and more so. Because any other workplace where that happened, generally I would just shrug and say, why not? It's their call. But you can't do that for the very people who denied choice to everyone and then behaved like it didn't apply to them. So that's the dynamics of it. Everyone in the country has been saying it non-stop all week, and I'm frankly bored of hearing it even from myself, and particularly because the real criticisms that should be biting are not getting much of an airing at all. So this week, one of the co-founders of the Behavioural Insights team, the so-called Nudge Unit, who have been advising government on how to get compliance with COVID rules, he wrote an article for the Unheard website. One of the Nudge Unit founders, and yet he slammed the government for inappropriately using nudge theory to serve as an agency of state propaganda. He talked at length about the good intentions of the unit, the high quality of the work they'd done, and how it could make a difference to improve people's lives. And after all that, he said this: I believe his contribution has and can continue to serve governments well, but it must be used appropriately. For me, it means seeing the bigger picture, recognising what you can and can't measure, and seeing the potential for unintended consequences. For example, testing ways to make it easier for parents to engage with their children's homework and measuring improved education and parental engagement as a result is a great idea. But invoking different emotions to convince people to stay at home during the pandemic is less appropriate. The most egregious and far-reaching mistake made in responding to the pandemic has been the level of fear willingly conveyed on the public. Initially encouraged to boost public compliance, that fear seems to have subsequently driven policy decisions in a worrying feedback loop. Indeed, government creates fear to encourage compliance. Question then arises whether new restrictions are needed. Government notes for support across the country for new restrictions because everyone's so afraid, and so government gives people what they want. Who is leading who in that scenario? Well, nobody, but one side definitely shoved the other onto the slippery slope and is chasing behind trying to catch up. Nudging made subtle state influence palatable, but mixed with a state of emergency, have we inadvertently sanctioned state propaganda? And he goes on. The second principle, empiricism, can also be misused. It's an admirable intention, but not when pursued at the expense of other fundamental principles of good policy making designed to help us see the bigger picture. Placing all value on data risks deprioritizing reflection, reason and debate, and obscuring the limitations of that data as a depiction of reality. The more we measure something like COVID infections, the more prominent it becomes, and so the more it matters. But what's most feasible to measure now is not necessarily what's most important overall. Indeed, but as Boris would probably say, you're late to the party. Some of us have been saying this for over a year. But it matters because you're co-founder of the Nudge Unit. Now all we need is that whenever any public figure says that they're following the science, they're required to read those words and preferably write an essay on how it applies to whatever it was they were thinking about. This, surely, far more than attending a random party, is why Boris Johnson should resign, if indeed that is the case. Not because he went to the party, but because his team created such fear in the population as a matter of policy that many couldn't see the idea of going to a party as a morally normal thing to do again, not for 2 years and counting. And so the fact the country is outraged at him, an outrage fed by exactly that sense of fear about what such behaviour signifies, that probably is a degree of poetic justice after all. Does that mean that Boris Johnson is definitely finished? Well, I refer you to what I said the last time we were asking that question. He has entered the death spiral phase of his prime ministership. Like the death of 1,000 cuts, each one weakens him more and more until finally we'll reach that unkindest cut of all, the one that will tip him over the edge. Now, this could be that one, but I'm still minded that the Conservative Party is in no hurry to get rid of him, because on the election timetable, they'd like a replacement leader still to have some honeymoon credits by the time of the next election, because that person will get credit for not being Boris Johnson. They will get the sense of being a fresh start, but they still need to be fresh by the time of the election. If you've got that fresh start, you won't feel you need a Labour Party fresh start, not as much as you might otherwise have done. It could be that Johnson will force the timetable by becoming so toxic they have no choice, and maybe that just happened, but I'm betting that wouldn't be their preference just yet. Not everyone in the party would feel the same, of course. There's a growing influential group that feels Boris Johnson is so far off the spirit of true conservatism with his big spending and his enthusiasm for net zero that he's kind of basically a socialist. That group might well be less patient because they may feel that if change doesn't come soon, then many of the cultural values that they want to reinstate will have been eroded too far or absent for too long to ever bring back. But then ideologues in politics are always less patient than the party managers who care more about holding power than they do about high-minded principle. Now in the US, President Biden has good reason not to be patient. Everyone expects his party to do badly in the November midterm elections, which will eliminate their majority in the House. But does even that justify the sort of rhetoric he's been throwing around this week? Now we'll come to that in just a minute. But first, safetyism has been defined as this: a culture or belief system in which safety has become a sacred value, which means people are unwilling to make trade-offs demanded by other practical and moral concerns. It's the sort of thing that older people roll their eyes at, remembering how we all mostly survived just fine before the culture of health and safety became so prevalent. But some are going further than that. They're saying that we have actually transformed in profound ways that are robbing us of the will and the energy to thrive as a society. And they argue that this is backed up by the stats. Well, that's what we're going to be looking at for the deep dive video, going live on this channel on Monday next week at 7 p.m. UK time. Join me for that. In the US, the tempo and the partisan temper has been ratcheted up still further this week by President Joe Biden in a speech to urge support of the Democrats' voting rights legislation. Biden made some extraordinary claims. Using Georgia's recently passed voting laws as an example, he said that Republican-led laws were designed to suppress your vote, to subvert our elections. The goal of the former president and his allies is to disenfranchise anyone who votes against them. Simple as that. The facts won't matter. Your vote won't matter. They'll just decide what they want and then do it. That's the kind of power you see in totalitarian states, not in democracies. Well, what the heck is in that Georgia bill, you might be asking yourself. But he wasn't finished. He asked this: do you want to be on the side of Dr. King or George Wallace? Do you want to be on the side of John Lewis or Bull Connor? Do you want to be on the side of Abraham Lincoln or Jefferson Davis? Now, just to remind you, Bull Connor is the guy who set dogs on civil rights protesters. George Wallace said segregation today, segregation forever, and Jefferson Davis headed the Confederacy. These are the comparison points. They're the US civil rights equivalent of comparing someone to Hitler, basically. He said that the US Senate had become a shell of its former self. But as an institutionalist, I believe the threat to our democracy is so grave that we must find a way to pass these voting rights bills. Debate them, vote, let the majority prevail. And if that bare minimum is blocked, we have no option but to change the Senate rules, including getting rid of the filibuster for this. Now, the filibuster is the rule that requires a 60-40 vote to pass legislation, not a straight majority. And he pushed the point home again, just how nefarious the forces on the other side should be considered to be. History has never been kind to those who sided with voter suppression over voters' rights, and it will be less kind for those who side with election subversion. That is the kind of fighting talk you expect to be reserved for serious life and death issues. So I thought I should go with an open mind to see what is in the Georgia voting law that could generate that sort of apocalyptic partisanship. This from a president that, remember, promised to restore normality to the presidency. The Georgia Election Integrity Act 2021, it's a big piece of legislation, but the key measures attracting Democrat criticism seems to be things like reducing the number of days for early voting from 15 to 10 and requiring voters to present photo ID before they vote. Mail-in voting massively increased in 2020 because of a pandemic, with 1.3 million voting that way in Georgia. It will still be available, but only for people over 65, people with a disability, in the military or living overseas. The law specifies the number of drop boxes for early voting, something that didn't exist as a facility before 2020, but is being criticised for being fewer than what was made available on that occasion. As an independent observer with no dog in this race whatsoever, I am struggling to square the measures in the Georgia law with the highly charged rhetoric Joe Biden was using about it. Seems that I'm not the only one. Unsurprisingly, Republican Minority Senate leader Mitch McConnell criticised the speech sharply, saying Biden called millions of Americans his domestic enemies and shouted that if you disagree with him, you're George Wallace. If you don't pass the laws he wants, you're Bull Connor. And if you oppose giving Democrats untrammeled one-party control of the country, well, you're Jefferson Davis. How profoundly unpresidential. Look, I've known, liked and personally respected Joe Biden for many years. I did not recognise the man at the podium yesterday. Well, I suppose McConnell, with his track record of criticising President Trump, is one of the few Republicans who can get away with using the charge of unpresidential. I mean, even the supporters of Trump would probably acknowledge that their man's Twitter style, if nothing else, wasn't exactly what we understood to be presidential behaviour before 2016. But even people like CNN's Jake Tapper were moved to challenge this, putting it to Dick Durbin that invoking traitors and segregationists was a political comparison too far, and getting him to admit perhaps the president went a little too far in his rhetoric. Some of us do. The upshot of that heated rhetoric is that Democrats are looking for validation for what had previously been referred to as the nuclear option, seeking to overturn the Senate filibuster in order to get its federal level voting law passed. There is history of parties in power plotting to get rid of a filibuster and of minority parties accusing them of bringing about the end of a republic if they do so. Indeed, Republican Senator Tom Cotton mocked Chuck Schumer by giving a highly charged speech against removing the filibuster, saying that it would be doomsday for democracy, and then pointing out that every word he just said was a quote from Schumer himself from a couple of decades back when the shoe was on the other foot. Now, of course, that kind of cuts both ways, because it also highlights that once upon a time Republicans were keen to dispense with the filibuster themselves. None of these people, let's face it, are really standing for principle at this stage. It's all situational advantage. But this is where it is. Biden's message at this point is really that if you don't support his election reform bill, then you're supporting corrupt and one-sided elections from now on. From the outside, I have to say, this seems every bit as much of a lie as the so-called big lie, Trump's contention that there was a massive voter fraud and that's why he lost in 2020. That seems to be completely untrue, but no more so than the Democrats' current contention that there is massive voter suppression going on across the United States in general and in Georgia in particular. You may not like some of the policies. You may feel they don't optimise for your advantage in the way that you would wish. Nobody argues more vociferously for anything than politicians arguing for rules that favour their side, or at least don't disadvantage their side. But to argue that American democracy is being destroyed by a Georgia bill that provides drop-off boxes for votes that weren't a thing before 2020, that reduces early voting windows from 15 to 10 days, and all of the rest of it, that seems no less of a lie. If the purpose of all this was to put pressure on the two centrist Democrat senators, Manchin and Sinema, to get them to fall in line on abolishing the filibuster, that doesn't seem to have paid off, as Sinema confirmed that she had not revised her opposition to the move, meaning that Democrats won't have the votes to make this happen anyway. But that's even supposing anything so practical was the intent. Right now, American politicians are just drawn to these big rhetorical battles over their election system, like a pair of toddlers rushing off excitedly to play with firecrackers. You can't help but feel it's all going to end badly. A sentiment that could apply to a number of other situations right now, ranging from the standoff between Russia and Ukraine, all the way to the chances of Novak Djokovic playing in the Australian Open. We will come to both of those and more in just a minute. But first, it's time for a Q&A video. I've invited Patreon supporters to submit their questions first and foremost. Those will get precedence, of course, because they help to keep the channel going. But you can cut through by asking a really interesting question, one that will be equally fascinating to a wider audience. If you have such a question, add it in the comments below, preceding it with the word question in all caps, so that it's easy even for me to spot. And then join me for that discussion, going live on Wednesday next week at 7 p.m. UK time. See you there. And if you've made it this far, surely it's time to hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't done that already, and ring the bell so that you don't miss future content. Feed the algorithm gods, for they are angry, and it seems more likely to work than sacrificing a goat, although I rule nothing out. Thank you all. A tense standoff remains between Russia and the West over Ukraine this week. It's not been making the headlines particularly because essentially not much has happened, but the discussions have been taking place, basically confirming that the positions of both sides are completely incapable of meeting in the middle. So where does that leave us? It's created what many are describing as the worst crisis in European security for some decades. And the ball is now very much in President Putin's court. He had warned of military action if Russia's security demands, including its insistence that NATO withdraw forces from Eastern Europe, are not met. NATO has made it clear it does not intend to meet those demands, nor indeed the equally sensitive ones that guarantees should be made that Ukraine and Georgia will never join NATO. So now we wait. In other news, President Biden capped off a bad week with defeat at the Supreme Court, which blocked his attempted vaccine mandate for workplaces with over 100 employees. The decision by a majority of 6-3 seemed to signal no way forward for the attempt to use the occupational health body, OSHA, as a vehicle to enforce a federal requirement on vaccines. Had it gone into effect, it would have covered around 85 million American workers. Now, Biden urged business leaders to implement the measures anyway, to do it voluntarily, saying that this would protect workers, customers, and their communities. And some companies, no doubt, will choose to do so. And not just in America. IKEA in the UK announced that it was cutting sick pay for unvaccinated staff who were forced to self-isolate after having been a close contact. This after rules were changed in the UK, meaning that vaccinated people could isolate for shorter periods, while the unvaccinated people still had to do it for 10 days. The Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development pointed out that such differentiation creates perverse incentives to the unvaccinated to simply avoid getting tested if they couldn't afford the low-paid time off work. That didn't stop fashion retailer Next from announcing that it was following IKEA's lead. And speaking of consequences for the unvaccinated, right at the end of the week, the Australian government announced that it was using its prerogative to re-cancel Novak Djokovic's visa just days before the start of the Australian Open tennis tournament. Immigration Minister Alex Hawke said that it was being done, quote, on health and good order grounds, on the basis that it was in the public interest to do so. The situation did become tougher for Djokovic when it emerged that the original story, that he had done everything that was asked of him and he was simply the victim of Australian politics, turned out not to be quite the whole story, with evidence that he'd attended a photo shoot after knowing that he was COVID positive, and that he travelled to Spain while declaring on his visa application that he'd not travelled at all. Nevertheless, Djokovic's lawyers reportedly planned an immediate appeal to the latest move. If such an appeal were to be unsuccessful, and it's not looking that hopeful, the standard position would be that the cancellation would carry with it a 3-year ban from entering Australia. That provision could be waived if the government chose, although it's not entirely clear whether it would so choose. Where that would leave Australia's ownership of one of the 4 tennis Grand Slams, when the number 1 player in the world is banned from the country, that would be an interesting and an open question. Earlier in this episode, I described why the Conservatives, even if they decided they might want to get rid of Boris Johnson, might not be in a hurry to do it, because they're playing a longer game of managing the dynamic of holding on to political power. Now, forget the politics part of that. It's nevertheless a reminder that whenever you're tempted to just go for the short-term indulgence, that you often do so at the expense of the longer game. People who play the longer game tend to be successful because their achievements are things that they layer up over time. So people who play the shorter game will do things like spending more than they earn, not keeping themselves healthy and fit because they feel they've got other things they could be doing, paying attention only to the people they think can be of use to them. I've known a few people like that in my time. Live like that and you'll have some good days. You'll have some bad days. From time to time, you'll notice that you haven't really progressed as much in life as you wish that you had. The long game means doing things that some people will dismiss as being pretty boring. Saving some of that money or investing it, even though there's a dozen things that you would love to buy. Putting in the hard work to stay fit and healthy, making the time to do that. Treating people well with no expectation of return. Learning from your mistakes, teaching others what you know, and so on and so on. And that latter one is a set of behaviours that constitutes a system. You're doing things that are more likely to give you success and payback. Now, you don't know exactly when that happens, how much it will happen, but you just know that the more you do those things, the more resources, skills, opportunities and goodwill you're creating, which makes it more likely that you will be successful. It should mean that you can step back from the current day-to-day setbacks of life and see that longer game. To know that if you lose today, and there's always days when you will, it's still good that you can use that experience to come back stronger tomorrow. Some people might say that longer term stuff is for the birds. In the long term, we're all dead. So you might as well just enjoy yourself as much as you can right now. Well, there's plenty of testimony that people who have a purpose in life and manage their time and their discipline in line with that purpose, they actually get more day-to-day pleasure and satisfaction from that than any short-term indulgence any parties you might go to will ever create. Indulge yourself today, you might just find yourself needing that same indulgence tomorrow, and you've trained any resiliency out of yourself. So all you can do is just give in over and over. Do something today that you can build on tomorrow. That is a completely different feeling. It's a system that incrementally makes you stronger, as opposed to patterns of habitual behaviour that incrementally make you weaker. No one says it's easy, but it is the one attitude that most enduringly successful people seem to share. By the way, you might think, and you'd be right, that running a YouTube channel often involves playing the longer game, working on improving what you do, focusing on what's important and keeping going regardless of the setbacks, such as the YouTube algorithm playing tease as it has been known to do. And that's why, of course, I would like to thank the people who support this channel on Patreon. Without their support, it would be harder for sure to play the long game in that way, because so much more time would have to be spent doing things other than creating videos and working on improving them. I've started 2022 saying that I am committed to doing this again for the whole of the coming year, running that system, building on what came before. And that's just something I couldn't have done without those Patreon members. So if you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.